April 1943. In the concentration camp at Auschwitz, bodies were piled in heaps on the ground. Nazi soldiers clambered over the corpses, extracting gold teeth from their mouths and tearing wedding rings from women's fingers. 3 years earlier, art galleries and museums throughout Europe had been stripped bare. National banks had their holdings looted. By 1945, Germany had amassed stolen property worth billions of pounds. The gold was melted down and made into ingots. But when the war came to an end, most of the treasure had vanished. What happened to the gold, the currency, and the priceless artifacts? The answer lies in a grim odyssey that extends from the death camps to the Swiss banks, and to a group of men relentless in their pursuit of those responsible and bringing them to justice. This is the dramatic story of the hunt for Nazi gold, one of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War. The story begins with the man responsible for the Holocaust itself. Adolf Hitler's crusade to make Germany the predominant nation in the world necessitated robbery on a massive scale. He had no qualms about stealing from neighboring countries, emptying their national banks, and impounding state art collections. Hitler was fanatical about art. A failed painter himself, he intended to build the finest galleries in Europe, each stocked with stolen treasures, the very finest works purloined from French, Dutch, and Russian collections. He desperately needed money, and huge amounts of it, to create a new army, navy, and air force. The Nazis' first major act of treachery was to turn on their own people. At the heart of the fascist regime lay virulent racial hatred. Hitler demonized German Jews, blaming them for the country's defeat in the First World War, despite the fact that Jews had fought alongside Aryan Germans throughout it. Jewish businesses were boycotted, shops were daubed with anti-Semitic slogans, and their owners humiliated. Nazi thugs in brown shirt uniforms were encouraged to attack Jewish people openly in the streets. Many businesses were forced to close. Influential men in the Nazi hierarchy were permitted to buy up Jewish companies for next to nothing. Wealthy Jews such as Louis de Rothschild saw their grand houses confiscated and their possessions looted. Many of them left Germany for the safety of neutral countries and deposited their money in foreign banks.
Because they thought that if they could save their money, they could somehow bargain to save themselves. They really thought that they still had a negotiable position if they had something to negotiate with. And that's why they wanted to get it out, because they assumed that that could be their only ticket to safety.
Switzerland was one of the most popular destinations for Jewish businessmen. Swiss banks were famous for their watertight security and strict rules of discretion. The emigrants expected to retrieve their fortunes after Nazi oppression ended, or so they fondly hoped. But instead, conditions in Germany under the Nazis deteriorated rapidly. During the 1930s, concentration camps were opened to accommodate all political opponents to Hitler. From 1942 onwards, some of the concentration camps became death camps for the systematic murder of Jews. It was horrific. Upon arrival at the camp, each person was stripped of everything. Many had their heads shaved, the hair to be used as stuffing for furniture. Those valuables not removed from the living were later stripped from the dead. Gold teeth were wrenched from the mouths of corpses. Some Jews were comparatively fortunate. They became slave laborers. But most met death in the gas chambers.
I can't even describe you the way they were treating us. They weren't treating us like people. They were treating us like animals. Right away, they were just looking in your mouth. And my father, before they took us in to the shower rooms, they pulled out his crowns from his mouth, and if it hurted, he couldn't, they didn't use nothing. They just had a pair of pliers, and they, like, if you tied on a horse, and this is the way they pulled it out.
The gold was melted down into bars and dispatched to SS vaults. Many of these ingots ended up in Swiss banks, where they lay hidden for years. But Hitler didn't only take fortunes from wealthy Jews. Before the war, massive loans and political contributions were coerced from non-Jewish German bankers, industrialists, and other businessmen. These men hoped to gain favors, or at least survive, under the brutal regime of the Third Reich. The price for Nazi protection was high. Those who did not pay could end up in a concentration camp. There was no legal protection against the demands of the Nazis because they had remade the laws. With German coffers bulging with stolen money, Hitler was able to embark on the next stage of his great swindle. In March 1938, German troops entered Vienna, the capital of Austria. They claimed they were uniting all German peoples under one banner, and called the invasion the Anschluss. As part of this forced union, the Austrian National Bank was liquidated, and its assets transferred to the German Reichsbank. In this first act of foreign theft, Hitler added some 90,000 kilograms of gold to his own treasury, a total value then of over $100 million US, today worth a clear $1 billion. A year later, Hitler turned his greedy attention to Czechoslovakia. Under the guise of protecting Germans living in the Sudetenland, seized in October 1938, he annexed the rest of the country to his growing empire. But before the Germans assumed full control of the country, the Czech National Bank in Prague had the foresight to move some of its assets to the Bank of England via Switzerland. But Reichsbank officials quickly stepped in and redirected $40 million worth of Czech gold to Germany. They even tracked down the gold already transferred to Britain and forced Bank of England officials and their Swiss colleagues to hand over another $26 million worth of gold. By 1939, foreign invasion had become profitable for the Nazis. The business of channeling finances of entire countries into German and Swiss banks had got into full swing. The road to world conflict had been laid, and it was paved with stolen gold. In September 1939, dark clouds gathered over Europe. Britain and France threatened war if Germany invaded Poland. Hitler called their bluff. He bombed Warsaw and sent in his troops. Nazi high command had already profited from foreign invasion and hoped to do the same in Poland. But when the German soldiers marched into Warsaw, they found themselves thwarted. Officials of the Bank of Poland had already moved much of its gold reserve out of the country. The gold had been transported through Romania and Turkey to France, where it was deposited in the French National Bank. Hitler then turned westward. His armies stormed into the Netherlands. The Dutch surrendered in May 1940, and German officials immediately ransacked the Bank of Amsterdam. Over the next 5 years of occupation, they redirected $163 million worth of gold to the Third Reich. Belgium was next, but its National Bank officials had followed Poland's example and swiftly moved the country's entire treasury into French banks. But all three nations lost control of their destinies just a month later, as France fell to the invading Germans in June 1940. Nevertheless, a large quantity of Polish and Belgian gold had already been shipped to the West African port of Dakar. An Anglo-French force tried to rescue the hoard, but Vichy French naval units controlled by Germany forced the Allies to withdraw. Another large quantity of French gold had been shipped to Martinique, a distant French colony in the West Indies. Prolonged negotiations between Vichy France under Marshal Pétain and Nazi Germany followed. Hitler wanted the gold, but he didn't wish to waste his resources by occupying the whole of Vichy France to secure it. The Führer intended to force Pétain to hand over the Polish, Belgian and French gold. Most of the Belgian reserve eventually ended up in Nazi hands. By the end of 1942, Pétain appeared willing to hand over the Polish gold. But by that time, the Allies had proved victorious in North Africa. Thus, German access to gold stored in West Africa was severed forever. The Nazi conquest of Europe had resulted in the most massive shift of money in world history. The gold reserves of entire countries were taken. This vast resource kept the German war machine driving forward. But where did all the money go? Some of it was stored by the Reichsbank in Germany, but much of it was used to acquire the more immediately useful asset, hard currency. Hitler needed ready cash, not ingots, to pay for his weapons. The best place to change looted gold into hard currency was the capital of European banking, Switzerland. That country was about to play a vital and highly controversial role in the grim story of stolen Nazi gold. Switzerland took pride in its long history of neutrality, standing apart from many European conflicts. It used this position to enhance its international reputation as a safe haven for foreign money. Its banks flourished on an image of rigorous security, discreet privacy, and honest dealing. But during the Second World War, this image masked a dreadful secret that began to cast a dark shadow over its supposed neutrality and reputation for fair trading. The Swiss claimed they stood apart from Nazi Germany in the 1940s, but in fact, they were closely involved with the Third Reich. The country's 7-man federal council, led by Marcel Pilet-Golaz, took the decision that, in order to preserve Swiss independence, it would have to do business with Hitler. In its crudest form, this meant that Switzerland would not open its borders to thousands of Jewish refugees who hoped to escape into neutral territory, and who had already deposited massive amounts of money into Swiss banks. To do so would provoke the Nazis into action.
That might make Hitler furious, and he would decide, I have to attack those people who seem to be friendly with the Jews.
The Germans made it easy for the Swiss border guards by having a J printed in Jewish passports.
Und man musste ein Foto haben, wo das linke Ohr ist sichtbar war, also wie für die Verbrecherkartei. Und dann musste man Fingerabdrücke geben. Und es ist natürlich schon sehr diskriminierend. Und für viele hat das bedeutet, dass sie dann einfach zurückgewiesen worden sind. Man hat sie gerade erkannt. Und das ist das Todesurteil gewesen.
Many Jews who reached the Swiss border were sent back to face certain death in the camps. And many Jews who were stopped at the border committed suicide rather than be sent back. Hitler needed Switzerland to take his gold and launder it into hard currency, with which he could buy the weapons to continue to prosecute the war. Many of these armaments were manufactured in Swiss factories, so the Swiss raked in even more money in a second level of transaction, That is, by selling vast amounts of ammunition and other vital war material to Germany. Because of Switzerland's supposed neutrality, its arms factories could not be bombed by the Allies, even though their weapons were destined for Hitler's war against them. While British and American bombers successfully dented the industrial capacity of the Third Reich, in Switzerland, the unmolested factories continued to churn out weapons.
There's a document which we've read, which I find curious, sent by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of State in 1940, I believe it was 43, in the spring of 43. And it said that our bombing of Germany was rather ineffective because the Swiss kept shipping in the stuff to replace it.
To exacerbate the situation, the Swiss Air Force actually shot down Allied bombers that strayed into its airspace. It remains one of the most glaring acts of hypocrisy of the whole war. But even worse, recent evidence confirms that Switzerland allowed German trains carrying enslaved laborers to pass through its neutral territory. A Swiss railwayman, Otto Frey, remembers being ordered to keep this fact a secret.
Ab und zu hat man das etwa Hilferuf gehört, aber das ist also minim gesehen. Die sind natürlich auch vom Ausgangsbahnhof Gasso sind die vorgemeldet worden und man hat dann die mit einer gewissen Sorgfalt müssen behandeln, dass sie schlanker weg wieder zu der Schweiz ausgekommen sind.
Even trains destined for the death camps made their way through Swiss stations. There's evidence that in late 1943 in Zurich, a train carrying Italian Jews was halted. One woman remembers a chilling night when she was asked to take soup to the station.
There was a Red Cross official, the lady, who told us the trains would come in at night, that we were supposed to bring flashlights, that we would be in teams of 4. Very slowly, these cars came and stopped, and a man came out from our station, and one of the recollections I had is, although it was very dark, when this car opened, the man or the face who peeked out was very white. It was very tense. And I also remember I thought, what would happen if all of a sudden all these people pushed this man aside and came tumbling out of the car? And I was worried. In a way, I wished they would be free, but in a way, I didn't want them to come out. We knew that they were going to Germany. We knew they were Jews. We knew about the concentration camps.
Switzerland was clearly not innocent, and certainly complicit in some of the most heinous crimes of the Nazi regime. But even as the war turned against Hitler, the Swiss continued to prosper. As German armies retreated, many Nazis, fearing Allied retribution, deposited their ill-gotten gains into Swiss banks. In a nightmare development, this wealth was earmarked to create one of Nazism's most perverse schemes, the infrastructure of the Fourth Reich. By the autumn of 1943, Hitler's dream of a Nazi empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals began to evaporate. The army had got bogged down in the mud and ice of Russia. Thousands of casualties were strewn across the landscape, from Stalingrad to Kursk. Senior Nazi bureaucrats realized their illicit wealth was no longer safe in the Third Reich. The steady flow of looted gold into secret bank accounts in Switzerland grew into a flood. Stolen art treasures were auctioned in Swiss art galleries, and the proceeds used to prepare escape routes for senior Nazis to evade the encroaching Allied forces. But in 1944, British and American intelligence agents became aware of these transactions. They responded by initiating Operation Safe Haven, Its mission was to locate, track and retrieve Nazi assets that were being moved into neutral countries. The revelations from their covert investigation were appalling. Under cover of Swiss secrecy laws, the Nazis appeared to have shipped over $6 billion in assets to Switzerland between 1938 and 1945. In today's values, that represents at least $60 billion. A lot of this money was to be used to help high-ranking Nazis escape from Allied justice. An American intelligence report identified a massive sum held by Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. The senior Nazi politician used the German embassy in Geneva to launder a fortune in gold to banks in Lugano and Lucerne, a fortune that remained in secret accounts long after the war was over. Ribbentrop may also have helped transfer funds for German industrialists who were planning to rebuild their business empires after the war was over. But the deceit did Ribbentrop no good. He was tried at Nuremberg in 1945 and found guilty of war crimes. 11 months later, he was hanged. In Holland, another escape fund belonging to German industrialists was located by American intelligence agents. But buried within the safe haven files is an even more disturbing revelation. Evidence that some German industrialists were preparing to resurrect a new Reich after the war. They worked with a group of top SS officers. Using neutral countries, they planned to accumulate wealth and missile technology that could be channeled to Nazis working underground in post-war Germany. The plan was never implemented, but neither has the money ever been recovered. Yet another safe haven document contains the names, addresses and telephone numbers of over 30 Swiss lawyers who, the agents believed, were hiding German assets, including gold and looted art treasures. In the final year of the war, Allied bombing pounded the heart of Berlin into rubble. The Reichsbank and its branches suffered severe damage, and the Nazis decided to disperse their holdings to hiding places scattered around the country. The wealth was sent south by truck and train to Bavaria. There it was hidden in deep caves in the Alps. Most of it was recovered by the Allies at the end of the war, but $20 million worth of it has never been found.